Today, I'm going to tackle something a little bit bigger than I have before, Total War Warhammer. This video is both for returning fans and people who are on the fence about buying it. Let's start with something that will give you a quick sense of the world. Before we jump straight into the game, I want to give a little bit of context on the two companies that made this possible. First, we're going to start with the Warhammer brand itself. Warhammer, later branded Warhammer Fantasy, was a tabletop war game released in 1983 by Games Workshop, a British company, that originally was a small chain of general game shops, which later found an identity of its own after creating the Warhammer world. The basic gist of the Warhammer setting can be generalized down to this. It's a fantasy world where dozens of various factions and races, such as men, orcs, elves, lizardmen, and undead, are in a constant state of war with one another. All the while, a massive horde of demons are continually marching on them to bring about the end of the world. In this setting, there is no such thing as true peace, just a grim, dark future for everybody. This world proved to be so popular that it spawned a countless number of books, fleshing out the world and its histories. Unfortunately, though, the Warhammer Fantasy was killed in 2015 during an event called the End Times, which ended with the destruction of the world, its characters, and all the various histories surrounding it. As you could probably imagine, this didn't exactly sit well with the fans who spent over 30 years in this world. One good thing to come out of this, however, was that Games Workshop decided to license out the world that they just killed, and this would eventually find its way to the Total War franchise. While Warhammer Fantasy may be dead, the Total War franchise was growing stronger every year. Even after some disastrous games, the user base only continued to grow. As for Total War's history, it was created by Creative Assembly, another British company, and ever since its first game in the franchise, it's become synonymous with gigantic battles within historical settings of the real world. The merger of these two IPs into Total War Warhammer is a match made in heaven for the fans of either series. Being honest, I never had any interest in Warhammer, even after Total Warhammer's announcement. But after looking into the world, I decided to try it out and I loved it ever since. There are a few deviations from the standard Total War formula that I'll explain before getting into an actual review. First off, lords no longer age and die like in previous Total Wars. Instead, a select few of them are considered legendary, which means they have a special upgrade path and abilities that can only be wounded instead of being outright killed. Instead, you have to destroy the whole faction to finally defeat them. Magic is a whole new element to the game that can drastically change the battles. They function similarly to general abilities in previous Total War titles, but also have direct damage effects to enemies, healing of your own troops, or providing massive buffs or debuffs to units on the battlefield. Aerial combat is also introduced, where some units can both fight on ground and in the skies. They are still limited to the normal battle map, but can be used to quickly destroy enemy artillery, or pick off units that are away from the main force. Corruption is a feature that can best be compared to a religion in the old games, but it's much more important. For some races, you will lose men if you travel to lands that are not suited for you, like Chaos going into untainted lands, or humans in undead lands. This constantly makes you have to plan your future expansion and routes, which adds a whole new element to the game. All in all, I think it's obvious. A lot of work went into making this game feel unique and making it fit its setting. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into the actual retrospective. Let me start off with the things I loved about this game. First off is unit variety, and how every faction actually feels unique, and fills a unique role with its own weaknesses and counters to the different races that don't feel completely hopeless fighting. Other Total War games came with nearly a dozen factions to play as at launch, and at least 3 new ones per DLC. Compared to 1 faction per DLC and 4 at the base game, this might seem like a massive downgrade, but in reality, how much is actually packed into each one of these races? It almost outweighs the previous DLC's 3. Another thing I love is the magic and power system. These abilities can seem underpowered at first, but when you have massive flames or meteors tearing down your opponent's lines, you can actually win battles that would normally be a one-sided slaughter. The game also features one of the best endgames of any Total War. At a certain point in the game that is decided by either your turn count or your power, chaos will emerge out of the north in greater numbers, and eventually be strong enough to march south, destroying any civilization in its path, hell-bent on removing every faction off the face of the world. This leads to some really cool scenarios where you and the other races have to band together and destroy them before they destroy you. But this can be complicated if every faction hates you from what you did in the early game, or if you sat around and watched as they all destroyed each other to the point where even if they all banded together, they couldn't defeat chaos. Also, if there is one thing this game cannot be faulted for, it's its aesthetics. Everything is beautifully detailed, from the campaign map changing based on the amount of corruption in a province, to each and every unit being fully detailed and brought to life from the original tabletop game. And speaking of the original tabletop game, if you zoom your map out enough, it actually resembles a wooden board that you're playing a tabletop game on. It's a nice touch. And the music also fits each faction pretty nicely, and really makes you pumped about ambushing an army or holding a last stand.
Keep your heads down, men! They're casting spells! Stop them!
The whole thing makes you feel like a rock album cover has been brought to life. With all of this said, however, I have a lot of problems with this game that need to be covered. First would be the absolute butchering of the siege system. In the last Total War game, Attila, one of the biggest selling points was the advanced siege system that went to great lengths to improve itself over previous Total War titles. In Warhammer, however, they just completely removed all of this. The map is restricted down to 2 single gates, which typically one long wall divides attackers from the defenders. This completely removes all strategy involved in siege battles, turning it into choosing a side to attack, and then rushing all your troops forward. By restricting player choice and decision, it kills any desire to actually fight in city battles, and leads to me skipping the majority of them. While in Attila, siege battles were one of the highlights for me. However, I can understand why they would want to restrict the siege system for now. Mainly because flying units would be unbearable to fight in a massive city battle, when they can easily slip through an undefended section of the walls and fly straight behind the defenders. Also, large city maps were a dual-edged sword. They provide strategy for inter-city conflicts by allowing multiple paths to the capture points. However, this often leads to only a fourth of the map actually being utilized, and that's only if the attackers broke through the walls. The final gripe I have with this system is the capture points. Instead of one single one in the heart of the city that defenders could rally to and make a final stand, on some maps there are a few of them plopped down by the gates, which prevents any sort of strategic retreating. Another point I will probably go more in depth with in the future is power creep of the new factions. Some base game factions cannot hold their own against the ones released as DLC. This was remedied somewhat in future patches, but still remains a problem to this day, with dwarves being consistently overpowered and taking over most of the map, and the Empire falling apart within only a few turns. Also, naval combat is completely absent in the title, which is even more baffling because Warhammer has a massive amount of lore surrounding the topic in the game Man of War. Removing it isn't as big of a deal as the siege battles to me because I, like many other players, chose to skip the majority of my naval battles in previous games, but it still leaves a void nonetheless. The last thing I want to gripe about is the multiplayer, and about how bare bones it is. It's completely outdone by previous games like Shogun 2. At the moment, I have next to no desire to play it. Overall, I find this to be a great but deeply flawed game that could be remedied with future patching. So, let's just go ahead and get into the closing remarks then. For this video, I just wanted to give my thoughts on the game as a whole, very broadly, and a lot of this stuff can be applied to the sequel, which I may get around to giving my thoughts on in the future. I hope to cover all the factions in more depth in later videos, along with the DLC released. As for their mod support, this game is even more restricted than it was in the last few Total War games. Not only can't you edit the campaign map, but you can't create mods that deviate from the Warhammer Fantasy setting. As you can imagine, this prevents things like massive overhauls from ever happening, like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. However, some mods are able to create some amazing things, like Steel Faith Overhaul, which makes the game a million times more playable, or the Grand Campaign Custom Map mod, that makes the siege system at least somewhat better than it was in vanilla game. So, like I said, this probably isn't the last time I'll be giving my thoughts on this series, so give me feedback down in the comments to let me know what you all think, and if you're new to the channel, I've made other videos similar to this, so definitely check those out. Anyways, thanks for watching, and see you next time.